January 5th, 1942. The streets of Tokyo roared with celebration. Banners fluttering, voices raised in triumph. Japan's empire seemed unstoppable. From the jungles of Malaya to the ruins of Manila, the rising sun flew victorious over Asia. But far from the cheers aboard the vast steel flagship Yamato, one man sat in silence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Combined Fleet. He studied the war reports spread across his desk, the Philippines collapsing, Singapore cornered, the British fleet shattered. It was, by every measure, a moment of glory. Yet Yamamoto's expression was grave. He had seen too many wars to mistake momentum for victory. He turned to his chief of staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, and gave a quiet order. Begin preparing for the second stage of operations. I want the plans ready by mid-February. Typewriters clicking, muffled voices of officers. In Tokyo, the Army and Navy strategists argued endlessly. The military nationalists demanded expansion without limit. Australia, India, perhaps even America's West Coast. They saw destiny written in conquest. But Yamamoto was different. He was not blind to Japan's triumph. Yet he feared the price of arrogance. He had warned his superiors long before the first shot was fired. If we must go to war with America, for 6 months we will run wild with victory. But after that, I can promise nothing. Now, only 1 month after Pearl Harbor, his prediction already haunted him. Friends in the Imperial General Staff had urged him to stay at sea. They feared he might be assassinated for opposing unlimited war. He had called for statesmanship, not endless blood. But men like Prince Kono and the ultra-nationalists in Tokyo believed Japan's destiny could be forged only in flame. They dismissed Yamamoto's caution as cowardice. Ugaki, his loyal aide, wrote in his diary, "The Admiral speaks of foresight, of ending this war before it consumes us all. But Tokyo listens only to the sound of its own applause." Months earlier, Yamamoto had met with an old friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, a nationalist leader whose influence reached deep into the political elite. Over cups of bitter tea at the Imperial Navy Club, Yamamoto had spoken with a chilling clarity. At first, he said, we will have everything our own way, stretching out like an octopus, spreading its tentacles across the Pacific. But soon, that octopus will lie flat, gasping for breath. He told Sasakawa that the moment Singapore fell, Japan must seek peace, for that would be the last chance to negotiate from strength. He knew the British well, having met them during the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He had studied the Americans too, as Japan's naval attaché in Washington years earlier. He knew their spirit, their patience, and their industry. And he knew that waking such a giant was not victory, it was suicide delayed. Still down, the illusion of invincibility grew stronger by the day. Pearl Harbor had crippled the American battleship fleet. The British Pride, Repulse, and Prince of Wales lay beneath the waves off Malaya. Hong Kong had fallen. Manila was in flames. Every headline screamed the same word, victory. But Yamamoto saw the hidden truth behind the ink. Pearl Harbor had not destroyed America's carriers, and those carriers, now free, were ghosts that stalked the Pacific. He began to search for the next decisive strike, a blow so spectacular that it might force the Americans to the table. The Army wanted to push south into Australia. Others urged an invasion of India. Yamamoto dismissed both. They were costly, slow, and strategically hollow. He dreamed instead of one bold stroke, a trap that would draw out the enemy fleet and destroy it utterly. From this vision would come two names that would change the war forever. Operation MI, the assault on Midway, and Operation AL, the invasion of Alaska's Aleutian Islands. Yamamoto saw them not as conquests, but as bargaining chips, moves in a greater game to secure peace before Japan's luck ran dry. But in Tokyo, few understood. They mistook his caution for weakness, and even as he charted the course toward Midway, he carried a quiet dread, a sense that he was steering not toward triumph, but toward destiny. As the admiral stared out from the bridge of the Yamato, the sea stretched endless and dark before him. He whispered to no one in particular, "The war will burn bright for a year and a half, and then we shall face the darkness." Fade to silence. End of Part 1. Yamamoto's Vision, 1942. It's February 1942. In the grand offices of the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo, maps of Asia glowed red with conquest. Java, Borneo, the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong. Everywhere the rising sun had triumphed. But beneath the victory banners, arguments flared like sparks in dry straw. The army wanted to strike deeper, to India, to Australia, even to the Soviet border. The Navy wanted oil, bases, and a final crushing blow against the Americans. And in the middle of it all stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the reluctant architect of Japan's war. Isoroku Yamamoto was a visionary, to others a heretic. He had brought them glory at Pearl Harbor, but now he spoke of restraint. He warned that Japan's victories were the bright flame before the darkness. At staff meetings, younger officers whispered behind his back. They called him weak, a man afraid to finish what he had started. But Yamamoto was neither weak nor afraid, only realistic. He knew that America's industrial power was a sleeping volcano, and that each Japanese victory only shook it awake. In early March, Yamamoto wrote to his chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, "The politicians see glory. I see the storm. We must prepare not for celebration, but for endurance." He wanted a decisive battle, one so dramatic, so humiliating for the Americans, that Washington would be forced to negotiate. But where would that battle be fought? Tokyo's admirals circled the map like predators around prey. Australia, Ceylon, Hawaii, each option glittered with promise and danger. Yamamoto tapped the Pacific with his finger. "Here," he said softly, "Midway. A small atoll, yes, but the key to the ocean." Under his plan was audacious. He would lure the American carriers into a trap near Midway, ambush them with superior numbers, and shatter the last of their naval pride. With that victory, Japan could offer peace from a position of dominance, and Yamamoto's nightmare of a drawn-out war might be averted. Tokyo approved, though not without resistance. The army still wanted to attack Australia. Some even dreamed of marching into India to meet the Germans in the Middle East, but Yamamoto held firm. He would strike where the enemy did not expect. The slow drumbeat rising into radio static. Across the Pacific, in Washington, D.C., a different storm brewed. The mood was grim but determined. The memory of Pearl Harbor still burned, not as despair, but as fury. Admiral Ernest J. King, the iron-willed chief of naval operations, studied the same map Yamamoto had traced in ink. He saw Japan's empire spreading like fire across the islands, and he knew that if they didn't act soon, the Pacific would become a Japanese lake. King demanded a counterstroke. He didn't care about politics or allies or patience. He wanted to hit back, hard. In March, King summoned Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the calm, calculating commander of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz had inherited the ruins of Pearl Harbor, but he also had something Yamamoto didn't: time, and the unshakable resources of an industrial superpower. When King asked, "Can we hold the line?" Nimitz simply nodded. "We'll do more than hold it," he said. He began to rebuild the fleet, ship by ship, pilot by pilot. Carriers became America's new sword. And while Japan still ruled the waves, America was learning, fast. America was learning. In the shipyards of San Diego and Norfolk, men worked around the clock. The sound of rivets and steel echoed like the heartbeat of a nation awakening. Factories that once made cars now forged aircraft engines. The assembly lines rolled out Hellcats, Wildcats, and Avengers, machines built for vengeance. By spring, the United States had begun to turn its wounds into weapons. And behind the scenes, Intelligence officers were decoding fragments of Japanese transmissions. One name kept appearing: MI, Midway. In April, the war took an unexpected turn. From the decks of the carrier Hornet, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle launched 16 B-25 bombers toward Japan. Their raid on Tokyo did little physical damage, but its impact was thunderous. The illusion of Japanese invulnerability shattered in an instant. For the first time, air raid sirens howled over the imperial capital. Smoke drifted across the palace gardens. The people of Tokyo stared upward in disbelief. The Americans had struck back, and the shock echoed all the way to Yamamoto's flagship. Heavy footsteps on steel deck, faint radio chatter. To Yamamoto, the Doolittle Raid confirmed his worst fear. The Americans were only beginning to fight. He wrote in his log that night, "The enemy's resolve hardens with every blow. If we do not end this war quickly, we will be crushed beneath their factories." So he pushed the Midway plan forward with renewed urgency. Every ship, every pilot, every ounce of Japan's strength would converge on one battle. The stage was set, the greatest gamble in naval history. But what Yamamoto could not know was that the Americans already knew his plan. Thanks to the quiet brilliance of naval codebreakers at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz would meet the Japanese at Midway, waiting. Two great minds, two empires, and the fate of the Pacific balanced on a few small islands in the middle of the sea. As May turned to June, the world began to hold its breath. The Pacific, once a Japanese domain, was about to turn. As the world worked, June 1942, the proud ships of Japan's Imperial Navy steamed home from the Battle of Midway, not in triumph, but in silence. Four of their mightiest carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay burning beneath the waves. Hundreds of pilots gone. The flower of Japan's naval air arm lost in a single stunning week. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had promised the emperor victory. Instead, he had delivered disaster. It's not sure. In Tokyo, the news was buried beneath layers of lies. The public was told of a strategic withdrawal. Even many officers in the army did not know the truth. But among the naval command, the reality struck like a blade. The invincible fleet had met its match. The tide had turned, quietly, invisibly, in the middle of the Pacific. In Washington, Admiral Nimitz received the decrypted report. Midway was not just a victory, it was a miracle. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States had seized the initiative. But Nimitz knew the truth. A victory of defense means nothing without offense to follow. He looked to the southwest, to a string of islands stretching like stepping stones between America and Australia, the Solomon Islands. There, on a jungle-covered speck called Guadalcanal, the Japanese were building an airfield. If completed, it could cut the lifeline to Australia and threaten every Allied ship moving through the South Pacific. Time was running out. The U.S. Navy still reeled from its losses, but hesitation meant surrendering the initiative forever. So, Nimitz called for action, swift, desperate, and unprecedented. The first American offensive of the Pacific War. He gave the order to prepare an amphibious invasion, a landing operation that would test a generation of men who had never seen combat on such islands before. In the islands and the shipyards of San Diego and San Francisco, Marines packed gear into troop transports. The 1st Marine Division, young, untested, and full of restless energy, was chosen for the task. Their commander, Major General Alexander Vandegrift, studied the sparse intelligence reports. A few thousand Japanese engineers, some guards, nothing more, the analysts said. But Vandegrift had a sense that the enemy would fight harder than the papers implied. He told his men, "We're going to land in hell. Don't expect it to be easy." With gulls crying, distant machinery. Across the ocean, Yamamoto sat aboard the Yamato staring into the gray sea. The defeat at Midway had changed everything, but he refused to show weakness. He ordered the fleet to regroup, to push south once more. Japan would build a new defensive ring, from Rabaul to the Solomons, to keep the Americans out. At Rabaul, engineers worked day and night expanding the base, while transports ferried men and supplies to the newly captured islands. And on Guadalcanal, construction crews hacked a strip of jungle into an airfield. They called it Lunga Point. To the Americans, it would soon have another name, Henderson Field. By July 1942, the American High Command debated the risk. General Douglas MacArthur in Australia demanded patience, more planes, more troops, more preparation. But Admiral Ernest King would hear none of it. He slammed his fist on the table. If we wait, they'll finish that airfield, and then we'll wait forever. The decision was made. The target, Guadalcanal, Operation Watchtower. Type of Thunder, the invasion force would be commanded by Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, with air cover under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the same man who had fought at Coral Sea and Midway. Admiral Robert L. Gormley would oversee the broader South Pacific Command, a quiet, cautious man suddenly given the task of launching America's first offensive of the war. It was an operation planned in haste, under-resourced, and far too ambitious. But there was no turning back. The invasion force throughout July, convoys gathered at New Zealand and Fiji. Hundreds of ships, troop carriers, cruisers, destroyers, formed into an armada stretching across the horizon. On the decks, Marines cleaned rifles, wrote letters home, and wondered what awaited them. They had been told the Japanese were few, perhaps unprepared. Some joked that it would be a walk in the sun. Others stared silently at the sea, their hands gripping the cold steel rails as the wind whipped across the decks. On August 6, 1942, the task force crossed the final miles toward Guadalcanal. 75 ships cut through the tropical mist, the largest amphibious force the United States had ever assembled. Above them, carrier planes roared into the dawn sky. Below, in the holds, thousands of Marines waited in the dim light, checking their weapons one last time. Someone whispered a prayer. Another muttered, "Let's get it done." And as the first rays of sunlight struck the ocean, Admiral Turner gave the order, "All hands, to your stations." The road to Guadalcanal had begun. End of Part 3. The Road to Guadalcanal. Staun, August 7, 1942. Over the dark waters of the Solomon Sea, the first rays of sunlight pierced through low clouds. An American armada stretched from horizon to horizon. 75 ships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and transports, each loaded with men who had never seen war before. They were about to change history. In the troop holds, the air was hot, thick with diesel and sweat. Marines sat shoulder to shoulder, helmets in their laps, rifles between their knees. Some prayed, others smoked in silence. On the loudspeakers, the words came clear and steady. "This is it, boys. We land at 900. No one cheered. They simply nodded. It was the first American offensive of the Second World War. See, the carriers Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp turned into the wind. Their decks trembled as dive bombers and fighters launched one after another, an iron swarm rising toward the islands ahead. Targets, Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and the small islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo. The mission: destroy enemy installations, suppress anti-aircraft fire, and clear the way for the landings. Bomb explosions in distance, anti-aircraft guns, sirens faint. At 0612 hours, Japanese radio operators on Tulagi sent a desperate message: enemy heavy bombardment in progress. Moments later, their signal went dead. Carrier aircraft swept in low, bombing supply dumps, radio stations, and seaplane bases. 9 float planes were destroyed in the water before they could take off. 8 more burned on the beaches. The Japanese defenders, shocked, unprepared, vanished into the jungle or the sea. Then came the ships. Cruisers and destroyers opened fire from the bay, their guns lighting the sky with relentless flashes. The roar was deafening. For 2 hours, the bombardment continued. Oil depots exploded, palm trees fell like matchsticks, and columns of black smoke rose over the island. At 0900 hours, the order came: land the troops. Go, go, go. The first waves of Marines climbed down cargo nets into waiting Higgins boats. Engines coughed, propellers churned, and the flotilla surged toward the shore. On Guadalcanal, they expected resistance, machine guns, mortars, a wall of fire, but there was none. When the boats grounded on the beaches east of Lunga Point, the Marines leapt into waist-deep surf and ran inland, finding only silence. Stop! They advanced cautiously through the coconut groves. No enemy fire, no mines, only abandoned tents, half-cooked rice, and the faint smell of smoke. One Marine wrote later, "It was like walking into an empty stage. The war had stepped out for a moment." The Japanese construction crews had fled, leaving bulldozers, tools, and even breakfast bowls on the tables. The Americans couldn't believe it. After months of buildup, their first invasion seemed easy, too easy. Got on Tulagi, across Iron Bottom Sound, it was a very different story. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt "Red" Edson and his Marine raiders stormed the beaches at 08:15. The jungle was dense, the ground rough, and within minutes, Japanese machine guns opened up from hidden caves. The defenders, men of the Yokohama Air Detachment, fought like fanatics. They fired until their weapons melted, then charged with bayonets, screaming, "Banzai!" into the smoke. Grenades, shouting, rain pouring. By nightfall, the Marines held only part of the island. At 10:30 that night, the Japanese counterattacked. They came through the darkness in small groups, knives and grenades in hand. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, desperate. In the flicker of muzzle flashes, men could see faces only a few feet away. When dawn came, 250 Japanese lay dead among the trees. 3 Marines had survived an entire night surrounded, fighting until their rifles were empty. Soft morning wind, jungle birds calling faintly. The next day, August 8th, reinforcements landed. The battle spread to Gavutu and Tanambogo, where small hills, barely 150 feet high, became fortresses of death. Japanese troops hurled grenades and crowbars at American tanks, trying to pry open their hatches. Some even set themselves on fire, clutching gasoline-soaked rags to ignite the machines. By the time the smoke cleared, every Japanese defender on those islands had been killed. Not one surrendered. Ship low, somber music. Back on Guadalcanal, the Marines established a beachhead around the unfinished airfield. They found fuel drums, anti-aircraft guns, and crates of rice stacked in neat rows. They named the airfield Henderson Field, in honor of a pilot killed at Midway. As night fell, fires from Tulagi flickered across the water, casting orange reflections over the anchored transports. The men believed the worst was over. They laughed, shared rations, and slept beside their rifles. But in the darkness beyond the horizon, Admiral Mikawa's cruiser force was already on the move, slipping south from Rabaul, straight toward them. The Americans had taken the beaches, but they had not yet faced the Japanese Navy. The invasion of Guadalcanal was far from over. It had only just begun. End of Part 4, The First American Invasion. Slow date, August 8, 1942. The tropical heat pressed down like a weight of iron. Smoke drifted through the palm trees, mingling with the smell of salt, cordite, and death. On the tiny island of Tulagi, just across the channel from Guadalcanal, the first real battle of the Pacific Ground War had begun. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt "Red" Edson's Marine raiders, hardened men, trained for jungle warfare, moved silently through the underbrush. Their faces were streaked with mud, their eyes fixed on the ridge ahead. Somewhere beyond the trees, the Japanese waited, experienced, disciplined, and determined to die rather than surrender. Lieutenant Colonel Marines reached a clearing, a small cricket field left behind from the British days. The grass was scorched, the air thick with smoke. As they crossed the open ground, gunfire erupted from the hillsides. Bullets cut through the palm trunks, kicking dirt and leaves into the air. The Japanese had dug deep into the slopes, hidden caves, rock bunkers, and machine gun nests that covered every approach. It was a trap. Shouting, branches breaking, Edson's men hit the ground. Some crawled forward, tossing grenades into the dark mouths of caves. Others used satchel charges, blasting holes through coral walls before storming in with bayonets. In one bunker, 17 Japanese soldiers were killed with explosives. When a Marine went in to collect a captured radio, 2 wounded soldiers shot him point blank before they died. There were no easy victories on Tulagi. The sun fell and the jungle turned black. Night in the Solomons was absolute, so dark you could not see your hand before your face. At 10:30 p.m., the Japanese struck back. They came in small groups, crawling through the grass, whispering to each other in the dark. Then, without warning, they charged. Grenades flashed, bayonets glinted in the lightning, and the jungle erupted in chaos. Screams, gunfire, the Marines fought from their foxholes, firing until the barrels of their rifles smoked and jammed. Men fought hand to hand, knives, shovels, fists. One Japanese officer led his men straight into the Marine perimeter, screaming, "Tenno Haika Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" They died to the last man. When dawn came, Edson walked through a field of silence broken only by the buzzing of flies. 250 Japanese were dead. Half his officers had been wounded or killed. Across the narrow channel, the battle raged on Gavutu and Tanambogo. These were small, rocky islets, barely half a mile across, but the Japanese had turned them into fortresses. As the Marines landed, they were met with heavy machine gun fire from caves on the cliffs. Snipers shot from the shadows. Grenades rolled down slopes. Every rock hit an enemy. American tanks rumbled ashore to support the infantry, but the Japanese swarmed them like hornets. They jammed crowbars under the treads, climbed onto the turrets, and thrust bayonets through open hatches. One Marine tank commander killed 23 attackers before he was stabbed to death. Another tank was set ablaze when Japanese soldiers threw gasoline-soaked rags into its vents. The flames lit the sky red. By afternoon, the beaches were littered with bodies, men from both sides locked in poses of death. The Marines advanced inch by inch, clearing each cave with grenades and fire. At one point, they discovered 3 Japanese officers trapped inside a dugout. They heard 3 shots. When the Marines entered, all 3 had committed suicide. This was not a battle for territory. It was a war of will, fought to the last breath. By the end of the second day, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo were in American hands. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. 90 Marines lay dead, 200 wounded. Nearly every Japanese defender, 500 men, had fought to the end. Not one had surrendered. For the Americans, it was a chilling revelation. This was no ordinary enemy. The Japanese fought not for survival, but for honor, for a death they believed sacred. Low wind through palm trees. On the beach, a Marine looked out across the water at Guadalcanal, its mountains wrapped in storm clouds. He whispered to his sergeant, "If they fight like this everywhere, this war will never end." His sergeant nodded, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. The smell of smoke, gunpowder, and burning oil hung over the islands. And in that haze, the Marines of Tulagi and Tanambogo learned the first lesson of the Pacific War, that victory here would be paid for in blood and fire. End of Part 5. Blood and Fire, Tulagi and Tanambogo. Night descended on the Solomons like a black curtain. On the beaches of Guadalcanal, Marines slept beside their rifles, believing the battle was won. Across the channel, fires still burned on Tulagi and Tanambogo, their orange glow reflected on the water. But far to the north, beyond the reach of American searchlights, the Imperial Japanese Navy was coming. Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, had set sail from Rabaul with 7 cruisers and a destroyer. His mission: strike the Allied invasion fleet at anchor before dawn, destroy it, and turn the tide. He knew the Americans were ashore, tired, scattered, unprepared for a night battle. And night battle was Japan's deadly art. Aboard the flagship Chokai, Mikawa stood on the bridge in silence. Rain fell in thin sheets, masking the glow of their funnels. His officers knew the plan. Approach from the northwest, thread the channel between the islands. The Americans would never see them coming. At midnight, they entered what the Japanese called the slot. Drums build slowly, rain thickens. At anchor off Guadalcanal, the Allied cruisers and destroyers drifted quietly. Australian and American ships formed a loose screen around the transports. Admiral Victor Crutchley of the Royal Navy had split his force into patrol groups around Savo Island. But the men were exhausted. Radar was primitive. Visibility was nil. The sea was as black as oil. At 1:30, a U.S. destroyer spotted something on its scope. Faint returns to the northwest. The watch officer hesitated, then dismissed it as rain echoes. Minutes later, Mikawa's cruisers slipped through the darkness at 30 knots, torpedo tubes already trained, torpedo mechanisms clacking. At 01:43, lookouts on the Japanese ships saw the silhouettes of Allied cruisers against the moonlit clouds. Target identified. Mikawa raised his hand. Fire torpedoes! Dozens of Type 93 long lance torpedoes slid into the sea, their oxygen engines leaving no wake. Sudden torpedo explosions, metal rending, men shouting. At 01:44, the cruiser Canberra was hit amidships. A sheet of flame shot skyward. Engines died. Ammunition cooked off. Seconds later, shells from Chokai and Aoba slammed into the U.S. cruiser Chicago. Her bridge was blown open. Bodies flung into the sea. The night erupted in fire and panic. The Americans fought blind. Searchlights stabbed the darkness and were instantly targeted by Japanese gunners. Shells tore through decks, igniting fuel and ammunition. The cruiser Vincennes was hit by torpedoes, then by more gunfire. She burned like a floating city on fire. Quincy tried to maneuver but was caught in crossfire from both sides. In minutes, she rolled over and sank. Silents were thrown into burning oil and shattered steel. Some swam through flames. Others went down with their ships. By 02:20, the waters north of Guadalcanal were a scene from hell. Ships ablaze, ammunition exploding, lifeboats tossed aside by waves of fire. Admiral Mikawa watched the carnage through his binoculars. He had won a stunning victory. What then came the moment of decision. His cruisers were low on fuel and ammunition. Dawn was approaching, and somewhere beyond the horizon, American carriers waited. Mikawa's staff urged him to press on, to attack the transports and crush the invasion. He hesitated, then turned away. Retreat, he ordered. The Japanese fleet slipped back into the night, leaving a sea of flaming wreckage behind. 4 Allied cruisers, Canberra, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes, were gone. Over 1,000 sailors had died in less than an hour. The waters around Savo Island would forever be known as Iron Bottom Sound. At sunrise, Marines on the beaches saw the black smoke on the horizon. They had no idea what had happened, only that the Navy was gone. They were alone now, surrounded by a vengeful enemy, their supplies limited, and the sea controlled by Japan. The battle for Guadalcanal had just entered its darkest hour. That dawn broke over Guadalcanal, August 9th, 1942. The sea was calm again, too calm. Charred wreckage drifted through the waves, and oil fires still burned where the cruisers had gone down. To the men on the beaches, it looked like victory. They didn't yet know they were alone. Messages came slowly through the crackle of static. The Navy was gone. The carriers had withdrawn. The cruisers had been sunk. General Vandegrift stood staring out toward the horizon. He said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, "We hold what we have." The Marines dug in around the unfinished airfield. They turned bulldozers into barricades, stacked sandbags, and built foxholes with their bare hands. Every man knew what was coming. The Japanese would return. The first Japanese counterattacks came at night. Columns of soldiers moved through the jungle, bayonets fixed, whispering prayers to their ancestors. They hit the Marine lines like a wave. Grenades burst, machine guns roared, and the rain turned the ground to mud. The fighting was close, savage and unrelenting. At dawn, hundreds of Japanese bodies lay in front of the wire. It was only the beginning. By mid-August, the Marines finished the airstrip. They named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a pilot killed at Midway. From that runway, battered American aircraft began to rise every morning. F-4F Wildcats, SBD Dauntless dive bombers. They called themselves the Cactus Air Force. It wasn't much, a handful of planes held together with luck and spare parts, but every flight meant survival. The Japanese struck back from Rabaul. Bombers came daily, escorted by Zero fighters. The Marines scrambled from foxholes as the airfield shook under bombardment. But each time, American pilots rose to meet them. Dogfights twisted through the tropical clouds, planes trailing smoke as they spiraled into the jungle below. The air war for Henderson Field became a daily ritual. Attack at dawn, survival by dusk. At sea, the U.S. Navy regrouped. New carriers and battleships steamed south under Admiral Nimitz's orders. The Japanese sent reinforcement convoys, the infamous Tokyo Express. Night after night, destroyers dashed down the slot, delivering troops and shells under cover of darkness. Each morning, the Marines woke to find new enemy trenches a little closer. In late August, the Japanese launched their great offensive, the Battle of the Tenaru. Hundreds of soldiers charged across the sandbar under moonlight, screaming, "Banzai!" as machine guns tore them apart. When it was over, the river ran red. The Marines had held, but the cost was heavy. By October, both sides were bleeding men and supplies. The Japanese tried again, at Bloody Ridge, at the Matanikau, and at sea in the Battle of Cape Esperance. Each time the Americans held. Each time Japan lost more ships, more planes, more men it could not replace. The tide was turning, slowly, painfully, irreversibly. In November came the decisive struggle, the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Over 4 nights and 3 days, battleships fought at point-blank range. The sea lit up with tracer fire and exploding shells. By the end, Japan had lost 2 battleships, 11 transports, and over 10,000 men. Guadalcanal was theirs no longer. On February 9, 1943, 6 months after the first landings, the last Japanese troops slipped away under cover of night. When dawn came, the Marines stood on the beaches they had once invaded, watching the sea they had bled for. The campaign was over. Guadalcanal was more than a battle. It was the moment America stopped retreating. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered, and a new kind of courage had been born in the mud, the jungle, and the surf. From this island, from these men, the road to victory in the Pacific began. They called it a battle for a few miles of jungle, but history would remember it as something greater. The Battle of Guadalcanal, the turning point of the Pacific War. The first time